Information Literacy Assignment Number 4 by Allison, Lauren, and Michelle. Our thesis statement is, how does the use of smartphones and tablets within the primary grades support educational development of children with autism? Ms. DeVille is a grade 3 teacher at Patricia Graham Public School. She has been teaching for 25 years and received a degree in criminology. She has 24 students in her current class. 3 of those students have individualized education plans, which Ms. DeVille has not yet read. She feels that she knows the best practices to support these children. Ms. DeVille has a very unique teaching philosophy and a variety of social, academic, and behavioral needs within her classroom, as well as students diagnosed with autism, oppositional defiant disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is our team. Mrs. DeVille, who is the teacher, Mr. Lewis, Mrs. Frankie, and Mrs. Smith, who are the primary teaching partners, and Mrs. Williams, who is the educational assistant. Glossary of terms. Building Collaborative Inquiry, BCI, the process by which educators build shared knowledge and learn together. It's also a common practice that high-performing school systems around the world use to create and sustain a strong teaching profession. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, a medical condition. Individuals that have ADHD have differences in their brain development and brain activity that affects their attention. Oppositional Defiant Disorder, ODD, a childhood disorder where children have patterns of hostile, disobedient, and defiant behaviors. Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, refers to a complex development brain disorder. Individuals with this disorder have difficulties with their social communication and social interaction, as well as restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors. Glossary of terms continued. Educational assistant. An educational assistant works alongside the teacher when developing and implementing programs for students that have an individualized education plan. EQAO, Education Quality and Accountability Office, runs a standardized test for grades 3, 6, 9, and 10. Inclusive Learning Environment. An inclusive learning environment is where teachers are providing their students with the opportunity to be successful by providing them with different modifications and technology to best support their individual needs. Individualized Education Plan. A document for students that have diagnosed with a learning or physical disability. The document provides modification to best support their learners' needs. Some background information on Mrs. DeVille and her students. Mrs. DeVille has a very traditional style of teaching, as opposed to the current styles today. She's unfamiliar with the use of technology. She mainly uses methods where children complete paper and pencil tasks and only uses a chalkboard during lessons, as well as handwritten short answer evaluations. The children sit in rows with girls on one side of the classroom and boys on the other. Work time is individual and with paper resources only. The children are not provided free play besides their scheduled recess. Mrs. DeVille started teaching in 1991 and has a degree in criminology. She does not collaborate with her coworkers. Other division teachers have technology in their classroom, which is making their classes run smoothly. When it comes to technology, Mrs. DeVille is unable to teach her students using the given technology. Alexa is a student in Mrs. DeVille's class with autism and anxiety. Mrs. DeVille has other students write for her because she feels that is best. Zane is a student who has been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. He often acts aggressively to others, so Mrs. DeVille has put his desk in a corner far away from the other students in the classroom. Harrison was diagnosed with ADHD. He often shouts out in class and is very disruptive. As a solution, Mrs. DeVille has him writing lines when this happens. Our scenario through the steps of the Big Six. Step number 1, task definition. A situation arises where Ms. DeVille got the EQAO results for the previous year. When it is proven to Ms. DeVille that her educational approach is not benefiting the child with autism in her class, the child has been falling behind within his literacy development skills, and behavioral changes have been noted at home as well. Ms. DeVille believes that it is not the classroom that is the issue, but the child. Step number 2, information seeking strategies. Ms. DeVille decides to look into the issue and do some research on her own on children with autism and external resources in order to help her and the child. Due to the fact that the child is falling behind in his school and grades, the parents have reached out to the principal, Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones meets with Ms. DeVille, and together they look into resources. They found that many children often have IEPs, Individual Education Plan, and sometimes an educational assistant, an EA, to work with the child. Ms. DeVille is not thrilled about the idea of having someone else in her classroom. However, she wants the best for the child. Step number 3. Location and access. Ms. DeVille comes into contact with the child's EA that has been appointed, and they decide to meet to discuss. During their meeting, the EA and Ms. DeVille discuss the issues, what has not worked, and things that have worked in the past for the EA. She explains that within today's learning environments, there has been a lot of beneficial incorporation of technology within the classroom. Ms. DeVille does not like this idea. As we have noticed, she does not seem like the one to incorporate change, and has a very rigid style of teaching. They both agreed to first assess the situation once in the classroom together. During her time in the classroom, the EA notices some changes that can and should be made in order to benefit and facilitate further development and learning for the child and others as well. When the EA and Ms. DeVille meet again, and the benefits of the use of technology have been discussed, they decide that the child would benefit from the use of a tablet with educational and communication-focused apps. Our scenario of the Big Six continue. Number 4, use of information. Mrs. DeVille and the EA discuss with the child's family and the principal, Mr. Jones, and they ask for approval to provide the child with the use of a tablet. With the approval, Mrs. DeVille and the EA gather information on apps that will help the child with their literacy development and communication skills. They download some apps, but have decided that since this has not been done in the classroom before, they will document and monitor what is being done and the positive or negative aspects of it all. The child is monitored during his individual learning sessions when the tablet is being used, so Mrs. DeVille and the EA can keep track of what apps are being used and how they are being used. Number 5, synthesis. Detailed notes are kept of each learning lesson on what the child is doing and how he is communicating. With these notes, Mrs. DeVille and the EA document what and when each app is being used, how the child is using it, if he likes it or not, the popularity of the app, easy or hard to use, or the relevancy, and how beneficial it is, like what skills each app focuses on for the child. An example documentation expert. November 20th, 2018. Using the ABC app, this focuses on the letters of the alphabet and phonics. When the child was using the ABC app, he was very excited to use the matching portion of the app. He was able to match the letters to the matching item word. The child was also speaking the letters and words while completing the task. If he did not know the letter or word, he would look to the staff for assistance. This showed improved skills in letter recognition, phonics, and slight communication skills. With the use of documentation, the EA suggests to Mrs. DeVille that sessions can also be videotaped for the use of themselves and the families. The videos can show how the child has improved, any information that they can look back on, and what can be implemented at home. Number 6, evaluation. After a few months of implementation and the use of the tablet in Mrs. DeVille's classroom, the child has shown enormous progression with his literacy and communication skills. Mrs. DeVille was at first not happy with the idea of change in her classroom and was definitely not considered tech-savvy. However, with the assistance of her EA, they were able to access a beneficial learning tool for the child within the classroom. The documentation and video recordings provide an extra resource for Mrs. DeVille and the child's family, which they continue to use and reference back to in future. Due to the positive and beneficial implementation of this experience, Mrs. DeVille decides to change her whole learning environment to create an inclusive and developmentally appropriate classroom for all of the children. Mrs. DeVille and the EA continue to work together to continue incorporating tablets within the classroom, as well as more technological resources in the future. Technology for everyone. Mrs. DeVille has decided to change her way of teaching and incorporate technology into the classroom. These are her steps. Number 1, she told the children starting next Monday they can bring their electronics to school and use them in the classroom. Number 2, send a letter home to all the parents advising them that the children can use their personal electronics in the classroom starting next Monday. Number 3, started looking for math and language games and apps that the children could use.
Mrs. DeVille met her class at the door. The children were excited. Each had their technology in hand and their signed form. Mrs. DeVille was also a bit nervous and excited as she was trying something new. She explained to the class what the routine would look like for the day. They would start out with silent reading for their language center, and then they'll go right into writing. During the writing center, children were to develop a story using the computer or tablet. Students were allowed to listen to music while they were completing the task. For their math center, Mrs. DeVille used a smartboard to implement a math program. It's an interactive game in the sense that the students are able to come up to the whiteboard to show their work to their classmates. For drama, they were showed how to play a game of charades using their electronics. They would get into groups and then videotape themselves acting out different movements. For social studies, Mrs. DeVille was teaching the class about the different provinces and territories in Ontario. She told the students to open up Google Classroom where they had a worksheet waiting for them. There, they would fill in the information as she was teaching. Mrs. DeVille was feeling quite proud of herself. She outlined how the day would go, gave the children the expectations, and left them to do their work. But it didn't seem to work, as the children began taking selfies, playing video games, and going on YouTube. Mrs. DeVille became very frustrated. She could not figure out why this was not working, as other classes have technology and they seem to be producing excellent work. During recess, she spoke to Mr. Lewis and explained how technology in her classroom was not working. Mr. Lewis suggested a team meeting to discuss the following: the use of school resources, develop a program in which they could use the classroom as the third teacher, and finally, understanding and following an IEP. Let's take a look at some of the problems Mrs. DeVille had within the classroom. Problem number 1. Mrs. DeVille was unaware of the benefits of using and incorporating technology within the classroom. She was so stuck in her ways and her teaching approach from when she first became a teacher that she did not progress her teaching with how children learn today. Problem number 2. Mrs. DeVille was set in her own style of teaching and was not open to working collaboratively with her division teachers. She did not think that she should change her teaching style, as she was under the impression that it was the best practice. And finally, in the beginning, Mrs. DeVille was not creating what is considered an inclusive learning environment. She disregarded children's individual educational plans. The classroom setup was separated by gender. Recess was the only free time that the children had to play. Students were segregated because of oppositional defiance disorder, and she did not promote free speech within the child that had ADHD. With the assistance from the educational assistant, Mrs. DeVille makes the decision to start incorporating technology within the classroom. By researching resources through the board's library for children with autism, Mrs. DeVille accessed more information and resources to educate herself on what she can do and different approaches she can take. When Mrs. DeVille felt like she had enough evidence on the benefits of using technology within the classroom, she created a plan of approach on how she would incorporate it. In order for it to be beneficial for her students and herself, Mrs. DeVille and the EA then began to successfully incorporate technology within the classroom. That is solution number 1. Once Mrs. DeVille was provided with the EQAO test results, she was made aware that it was in fact her teaching style. Mrs. DeVille took the results that were provided to her and started to think differently. She finally decided to reach out and work with the educational assistant to benefit her class. By doing this, Mrs. DeVille has the ability to work with someone and discuss different viewpoints and approaches. They both research and use this information to create a technology implementation plan that can be followed for each student within the classroom. That is solution number 2. And finally, once Mrs. DeVille accepted assistance from outside resources, she realized that the learning environment is a third educator for the children. Technological resources increase the amount of teaching tools and learning pathways. Following IEPs are beneficial to the children and the atmosphere of the classroom. By becoming aware of this information, with the help from the EA, Mrs. DeVille changed her teaching approach and the learning environment to promote and incorporate inclusivity.